All right, welcome. So today we are going to work through a price-taking firm. So our last unit, when we outlined the price-setting firm, those are firms that had some established market power. So they have some capacity to differentiate their product. They have established some barriers to entry, and so those make it difficult for other firms to come in and compete. For a price-taking firm, these are traditionally what we refer to as more on the competitive side or perfectly competitive market. In order to work through this, we're going to utilize our functions for our supply and demand to be able to identify the equilibrium price and quantity, and then we'll also use it to flesh out a couple concepts dealing with consumer and producer surplus. This is largely going to be more of a mechanical unit, and so I'm going to highlight how to work through these mechanics here. So we start with the information. Consider a competitive market for Greg Mankiw's, our famous economist, most popular textbook in Principles of Micro. And the daily demand for textbooks is given by this equation here, where the quantity demand is equal to 150 minus P. And our supply is given by the quantity supplied equals P minus 10. In order for us to identify and build out a supply and demand model for this, based on these functions, we want to first rewrite these in their inverse form. And so, first thing here, find the buyer's willingness to pay, or the inverse demand curve, by solving for P as a function of Q. And at what price is no one willing to pay for this textbook? And then we're going to build our figure piece by piece throughout this question. This will mimic what you see in the quiz, so if you can follow these steps, it should be relatively intuitive from there. So first step, I have my initial equation. I have my QD equals 150 minus P. I need to get my inverse demand function. And so what I want to do is rewrite this function with P as a function of Q, meaning, puts it like, just in the simplest terms, I just want to solve for P. And so it's just a little bit of simple algebra. I'm going to get P by itself. I'm going to add P to both sides, and I'm going to end up with the function P equals 150 minus QD. And the next part, I also want to, just to get us our functions out of the way, the next part is I need to get my inverse supply. So I'm going to do the same thing, start with my original supply function equals P minus 10, and I'm going to solve for P. Here, P is already positive by itself, so I'm just going to add 10 to both sides, and I get P equals QS plus 10. Now, for both of these questions, I need to build these functions into my figure, and I'm asked the same thing, like, at what price is no one willing to buy this book, and at what price is no one willing to sell this book? And so writing that in this inverse form, meaning P is a function of Q, so the price is determined by changes in our quantity here. Writing it in this form makes it a lot easier. So we'll go down to our figure and we'll start building out the pieces using these functions. So here's a nice supply and demand figure. Let me move this further out of the way. Then I also want to, let me give myself some space here. And I'm going to write out my functions over here as well. So I have my P equals 150 minus QD, and my P equals QS plus 10. And so this one corresponds to my demand, and this one corresponds to my supply. In order to build this out, I need to figure out at what price is no one willing to pay for this textbook. All that is identifying the intercept here. So for my demand curve over here, all I need to do, at what price is no one willing to pay for the textbook? Well, I just set my quantity demanded equal to 0. If I set my quantity demanded equal to 0, remember, 0's over here in our origin. At what price is no one willing to pay for our textbook? Set QD equal to 0. No one's willing to buy the textbook at $150. On the other side, with my supply curve, at what price is no one willing to sell it? I do the same thing. Set my QS equal to 0. And that tells me the price at which no one is willing to sell the textbook. So no one's willing to sell my textbook at $10, and no one is willing to purchase the textbook at $150. So here's my demand curve, here's my supply curve. There we go. So we've built out the first pieces there from our function. We could ground these out and actually highlight these pieces, but remember, past this point, we don't have, we're past the equilibrium point. So after, we have situations in which, sure, people are willing to supply it, and sure, people are willing to pay down here, but over here, everyone who's willing to pay, they have no one who's willing to supply it. So yes, you can ground the functions into your intercepts on the x-axis, but that's not going to be very meaningful for us at this time. So now we have our figure. We have our supply curve, we have our demand curve, we've identified our intercepts. Next thing we need to do is figure out the price and quantity in a competitive equilibrium. So what we're going to do is, because we have nicely written our functions in terms of P, we have both of them equal to one another, and so all we need to do is set the right hand side of this function equal to the right hand side of this, because P is equal to P, so we can set the right hand sides of these functions equal to one another and solve. One thing to note is that in equilibrium, our quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, and so as I'm doing this, I can drop the subscripts because these are going to be equal in equilibrium. So now let's just do that. It's just a little bit of algebra here. All we're going to do is set our two functions equal to one another. So I get my 150 minus Q, I'm dropping the subscripts because we're working in equilibrium, is equal to Q plus 10. So just working through a little bit of algebra as a refresher, we're going to add Q to both sides. We're going to subtract our 10 from both sides and then divide both sides by 2, and we're able to get our Q star. So once we get our Q star, I want to put that piece of information into my figure. Same thing that we've been working with throughout the semester. Now we just have some functional forms to ground our work. So I have my Q star equal to 70, and then in order for me to get my P star, remember our inverse functions are written in terms of P, all I need to do is plug my Q star back in. And important to note that because this is in equilibrium, it doesn't matter which one I choose. I can plug it into my inverse demand or plug it into my inverse supply, but I would probably choose supply here just because it's so much faster, it's so much easier with that functional form. So I'll plug my Q star back in, and I get P equals Q star plus 10 P star equals 80. So very neat for our work through there. I've plugged my Q star back into the supply side of my function, so I get P equals 70 plus 10. That gives me my P star. And from there, I have my equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so we've mapped out all of the pieces we've worked through thus far. The next piece becomes a little more difficult. And it's because we're introducing some new concepts here. So we're going to highlight and we're actually going to calculate the consumer surplus and producer surplus in the figure. First things first, in order for us to do this, we need to first know the rules for identifying consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the additional surplus you gain when you're willing to pay more for a product, but the market price is lower. And it's vice versa for the supplier. When we talk about when we talk about producer surplus, it's the additional surplus you gain when you were willing to sell the product for a lower price, but you were able to sell it for a higher price, a higher market price. And so in order for us to identify that, our consumer surplus has a nice rule. It's everything below our demand curve and above the equilibrium price, all the way up until equilibrium. And so we can see how that's illustrated here. We have all these consumers up here who are willing to pay, let's say, $140, $130, $120, but they only have to pay $80 for the textbook. So they get some additional surplus. And then on the other side, our rule for producers, or for producer surplus, is everything above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price, all the way up until our equilibrium quantity. We have a couple sellers down here who are willing to sell the textbook at, let's say, $30, $40, $50, but they get to sell it at the market price of $80. So they're gaining the additional surplus there. Now this surplus, obviously represented here, is an area. And so we can actually calculate the dollar amount of additional surplus gained by consumers and additional surplus gained by producers. In order to do that, all we need to do is calculate the area of this triangle. Area of a triangle, base times height times 1/2. And so the height of my triangle is the difference between my intercept and my equilibrium price. And so I have a height of 70. And the base is just Q star. And that's going to be the same for both. So the base of our triangle is Q star. So for my consumer surplus, I'm going to get 70 times 70 times 1/2. And if we do it for the producer surplus, we will get the same thing. It's the height is now the difference between my equilibrium price and the intercept for producers. And so we get 70 times 70 times 1/2. Okay, so that's how we work through the consumer and producer surplus. It's relatively straightforward. Important to note that in our example here, it's nice and neat, everything's equal, but it doesn't have to be the case. And so in our instance here, sure, consumers and producer surplus is going to be equivalent, but that doesn't have to be the case. So you might see some differences based on the functional forms. But that's how you work through that piece of the calculation. The last portion is this competitive equilibrium efficient? And this requires a little more detail. So we'll scroll down here, and we're going to look at two different figures. Our figure on the left here is a price-taking firm, and our figure on the right is a price-setting firm. So these more so mimic your monopolies, and these are more so our perfectly competitive firms. Make sure we can see that. Yeah, perfectly competitive. We know that all firms are going to produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. A couple things to note. When it comes to your price-taking firms, your perfectly competitive firms, your supply curve is equal to the marginal cost. And because these firms have no capacity to differentiate their product, there's no barriers to entry, they have to take the market price as given. And so the revenue they gain from each additional sale is just going to be P star. And so as a result, we end up maximizing the gains from trade. in a price-taking firm. When we think about the surplus, it just mimics what we worked through above. We maximize all the gains from trade all the way up until our equilibrium point here. So the price-taking firm is easy. Now, I want to recall back to our price-setting firm when we worked through that Excel sheet. We went through all those pieces. And we identified the point at which our marginal revenue was equal to marginal cost. In the figure for a price-setting firm, this looks a little different. Remember in our example, we highlighted an example where the marginal cost was equal to 100, and from that point, we worked through that Excel sheet and figured out, okay, the marginal cost is equal to 100. We identified where the marginal revenue was equal to that point. Because our price-setting firm has the capacity to develop barriers to entry, they have the capacity to differentiate their product, they now face a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. And so when we think about the intuition behind these price-taking firms, theirs is much more established by the supply side of the market. On the price-setting firm, theirs is much more determined by the demand side of the market. And so we identify this point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. In our Excel sheet, remember our marginal cost was constant at $100. Once we identify those 2 points, that gives us our Q star for a price-setting firm. But in order for us to identify the price that the firm is going to sell at, we need to take this up to the demand curve. That will tell us the price at which this firm will sell the product at. And so then we're left with a weird piece of information here. If we're identifying consumer and producer surplus, like this is the max that the firm is going to sell at. They're not going to sell at the equilibrium price over here. And so when we figure it out, everything below our demand curve and above our price is the consumer surplus, all the way up until the quantity that we'll sell it at. And then everything above the supply curve and below the price, all the way up to the quantity we sell it at, is the producer surplus. Now, this last piece over here, this triangle, I'm just going to like scribble. This is what we call dead weight loss. These are all the gains from trade that we could have if we had a more competitive market, but we lose out on it because this firm has established so many barriers to entry, differentiated products, all of these different factors. What we know is that when it comes to price setting firms, these are your monopolies, these are your Apple, Microsoft, etc. Producers are able to extract a much larger share of the surplus. And consumers lose out quite a bit. This is why we pay much higher prices, much higher markups for these type of products. In competitive markets, it's the opposite. We as consumers and producers share in the gains from surplus, we benefit from the trade, and we get much lower prices on average. And so this highlights that intuition. The important thing to note is that visually, anytime we have some deadweight loss, let me scroll down a little bit, anytime we have deadweight loss, we are operating inefficiently. We're not maximizing the gains from trade in a price setting firm. Anytime we're able to move up to that equilibrium point and we have no deadweight loss left in the figure, price taking firms or perfectly competitive markets are efficient. So it's a relatively detailed walkthrough, but it helps you work through the mechanics. I hope the video helps. If you have any questions, reach out via email or stop by during office hours. Thanks.